The town was waking slow beneath the weight of the sun, its dust-choked streets stretching wide between rows of weathered storefronts. The morning wind carried the clatter of shutters and the tired groan of wagon wheels, but it was another sound, a soft growl from an empty belly that seemed lost on all but one. She was a slip of a girl, no more than 11 or 12, drifting down that street as though the wind itself might blow her away. Her dress, once calico, hung in tatters, fabric faded by sun and ragged by time. Bare feet pressed into the dirt, leaving faint prints edged with blood where blisters had long since broken. She clutched her thin arms to her chest, as if trying to hold in the last of her strength. Her lips were cracked, her cheeks hollow, and yet her chin, small though it was, lifted high, a fragile banner of pride against the storm of stares. Her eyes searched everywhere, not for kindness, for she'd long since learned better, but for scraps. A half-eaten biscuit tossed from a saloon table, a crust of bread dropped by a careless hand, anything to still the aching pit that had become her constant companion. The hunger was not new. It had been gnawing for days, sharpening her ribs until they pressed against her skin like bars in a cage. The townsfolk noticed. They always noticed. Children darted across the street, their laughter shrill as they pointed at her raw feet. "No shoes," one boy shouted, and the others took it up as a cruel refrain. Their mirth cut sharper than any thorn she'd stepped on along the road. Women gathered in clusters outside the mercantile, bonnets dipping low as they whispered. "Pitiful thing," one murmured. Another sniffed. "Or shameless. Who lets a girl wander like that? No shoes, no family. Nothing but trouble following her." Men leaned in doorways, spitting dark streams into the dirt. Their eyes held no mercy, only the satisfaction of being higher on the ladder than one who had nothing at all. A gambler flicked the ash from his cigar and muttered, "Strays don't belong in town. Best she keep walking." The girl heard it all. Every sneer, every whisper, every laugh. She felt the stones of their words heavier than the dust on her shoulders. Yet she did not lower her head. Hunger had bent her body, but not her spirit. Her steps wavered, trembling hands brushing against her thin stomach as it twisted again, louder this time. She paused near a trough, staring at the water with desperate eyes. But before she could reach, a shopkeeper strode forward, slamming his hand against the wood. "Not for the likes of you," he snapped, shooing her away as though she were no more than a stray dog. She backed off, shoulders shaking but still her chin lifted, defiance flickering faint as a candle in the wind. She would not cry. Tears she had learned bought nothing, and so she walked on, barefoot through the dust, the morning sun casting her long, thin shadow down the street of a town that chose cruelty over compassion. She was hungry, she was small, and she was alone, but she was still standing. The girl's steps slowed as she reached the center of town. The dust clung to her legs like a second skin, her breath shallow from the weight of her empty stomach. She was a ghost among the living, but the town would not let her pass unseen. A boy no older than 15 stooped by the hitching post, his grin wicked as he palmed a stone. "Let's see if the stray can dance," he jeered. The other children gathered close, eager for cruelty, their voices high and sharp. The stone struck the dirt inches from her bare feet, sending up a spray of dust. She flinched, her blistered toes curling, but her chin never dropped. The crowd roared with laughter. "Look at her jump," another boy shouted, pitching a second stone that grazed the hem of her tattered dress. This time she stumbled, knees threatening to buckle, but she caught herself. She would not fall before them. She would not give them that satisfaction. Her lips pressed tight, trembling as if she wanted to cry but refused the release. Hunger and pride warred in her small frame. Tears might come easy to others, but hers had dried up long ago, replaced by something harder, something sharper. The women by the mercantile shook their heads, some clucking their tongues in mock pity. "Pitiful thing," one said, "but no good comes of a girl like that. Best she be driven out." Men leaned from the saloon porch, mugs in hand, the smoke of their cigars curling into the morning air. "Ain't she something?" one drawled, smirking. "Walking around like she belongs here. She'll be begging before sundown." Their laughter joined the children's, a cruel chorus that filled the street. Another stone flew. This one struck her shin with a dull thud. She staggered, her thin body folding inward, but still she didn't fall. Her hand gripped the edge of a barrel to steady herself. Her lips moved, the words quiet, nearly swallowed by the noise. I don't need them. I don't need anyone. I'll get through, but her body betrayed her. The tremor in her hands, the hollow weakness in her knees, the growl of her stomach, loud enough for even the nearest boy to hear. Hungry stray, he shouted, tossing another pebble that struck the dirt. The laughter swelled again. One by one, the doors of the shops shut. Latches clicked, windows darkened. She was no longer a child in need. She was a problem, something to be shut out, to be mocked from the safety of thresholds. And yet she walked forward, step by step, blistered feet dragging through the dirt. She muttered again, voice breaking this time. I don't need pity. I don't. But even she could hear the lie in her tone. Then beneath the noise, another sound joined the morning. A steady rhythm, soft at first, then growing clearer. Hooves striking the packed earth. A rider was coming. The girl didn't see him, not yet. Her eyes were fixed on the next stone hurled at her feet, the dust rising around her small frame. But the laughter faltered as some of the men on the porch turned their heads. The hooves drew closer, slow, deliberate, carrying with them the promise of interruption. Someone unseen was watching. The sound of hooves cut through the jeers like a warning. Slow, steady. Each strike of iron against the packed earth carried a weight that turned heads before the rider even came into view. Dust rose behind him, curling into the pale morning air, and the laughter that had filled the street began to falter. One cruel chuckle at a time. Out of the haze came a figure, broad-shouldered, tall in the saddle, his hat casting a long shadow over eyes that missed nothing. His coat was worn but strong, the leather darkened by years of trail dust and weather. His boots bore the scars of long miles, his horse lean but proud beneath him. He rode like a man who belonged to no one, yet commanded space wherever he went. The cowboy had come for supplies, or at least that was his intent when he set out that morning. But as he drew into the heart of town, the sight before him pulled at something older, something raw inside him. The frail girl stood barefoot in the street, her body trembling from hunger, her chin defiantly lifted while stones skittered around her feet. His reins tightened in one hand. The other rested loosely by his thigh, not near his gun yet, but near enough. His horse sensed the tension and slowed, hooves falling softer now as though to hush the noise of cruelty around them. He did not speak at once. Silence was his way, silence that pressed heavy, silence that made men uneasy. His eyes, sharp and narrowed beneath the brim of his hat, swept across the crowd. He saw the children's gleeful cruelty, the women's disdainful whispers, the men's mocking grins. 'Twas a sickness, he thought. How people found strength in breaking the weak, and yet he understood. Too well, long ago he had known hunger. He remembered the ache of an empty belly, the shame of being turned away from doorsteps, the sting of laughter behind him when he begged for scraps as a boy. He remembered the day his father's debts had cost them their land, the neighbors who once shook his hand now spitting in the dirt when he passed. He remembered standing small, barefoot himself, wondering if anyone in the world would see him as more than a burden. That memory never left him, and seeing it now, reflected in the girl's wide, desperate eyes, made his jaw tighten like iron. The crowd expected him to pass by. Cowboys were men of the trail, strangers to the affairs of townsfolk. But he did not move on. Instead, he reined his horse to a halt at the edge of the gathering. Dust swirled around them, and the street grew quieter, unease creeping into the edges of the laughter. The girl dared a glance up at him. For a heartbeat, their eyes met. Hers were wide, frightened but proud. His were steady, unreadable to all but her. Something in that look made her shoulders ease, just barely, as though she'd been holding her breath too long. Still, he did not speak. He sat in the saddle, posture straight, gaze unwavering. The silence lengthened, dragging over the crowd like a cold wind. Men shifted, clearing their throats. Women tugged at their shawls. Even the children's giggles thinned to uneasy whispers. Suspense clung to the air like smoke. Was he going to intervene, or was he only here to stare, to watch her shame like the rest of them? The cowboy let the weight of the moment build, his silence speaking louder than any shout. And as his hand brushed the worn leather of his reins, the message was clear to anyone with sense. This was no passing stranger. This was a man who'd seen cruelty before, and had never let it stand unchallenged for long. The next stone struck harder than the rest. It caught the girl on the shoulder, making her stagger. She bit her lip, refusing to cry, but the wince in her eyes was sharp enough to pierce the silence. That was the moment the cowboy's patience broke. In one smooth motion, he swung down from the saddle. His boots struck the dirt with a heavy finality that seemed to echo louder than the laughter. He walked forward, slow and steady, dust curling around his steps until he stood squarely between the girl and the crowd. The girl blinked up at him, wide-eyed. She clutched her thin arms across her chest as though trying to disappear. But he didn't move aside. His stance was broad, immovable, as if his very body had become a wall the town could not cross. His voice cut through the air. "Low but carrying like thunder. Stone a starving child. And you prove yourselves less than the dirt at her feet." The words landed heavier than any bullet. The laughter faltered, replaced by a ripple of mutters. A man near the front spat into the dust, his face twisted with contempt. "She's no better than a strayed dog." The man sneered. "Ain't worth the trouble." Another voice rose from the back. "Step aside, cowboy." "This ain't your fight." But he did not step aside. His hat cast a shadow across his eyes, but the steel in his gaze was plain enough. His hands rested loose at his sides, one close enough to his holster to remind every man watching who he was and what he was capable of. "Go on, then," he said, his voice deep and even. "If mocking a barefoot child makes you men, take your shot. But you'll have to go through me first." A ripple of unease swept the crowd. Hands hovered near belts, fingers brushing against pistol grips. The tension was a live wire, one spark away from erupting into violence. The girl pressed herself against his coat, trembling, her tiny body lost behind his frame. The saloon keeper chuckled nervously, trying to stir the crowd back to bravado. "Look at him playing protector. You think she's worth ruin, cowboy? Worth your blood?" He turned his head, slow, and locked eyes with the man. "I've spilled blood for less." That silenced the laughter. No one doubted his words. He was no braggart, no drunk gambler spoiling for a fight. He was a man with a reputation built on grit and iron. Stories of his past. Gunfights survived, trails endured, wrongs set right, circulated like campfire smoke across the frontier. Every man here had heard them. And every man here believed them. The murmurs grew weaker. No one stepped forward. No one dared draw first. The weight of his presence was heavier than the threat of any bullet. For a moment, the street held its breath. Dust drifted lazily through the sunlight. Children shifted behind their mothers' skirts, and the girl's shallow breaths whispered louder than the silence. Finally, one of the townsmen cursed under his breath, spat again, and backed away. Another followed. The tension broke not with a gunshot, but with retreat, the slow crumble of cruelty when faced with someone who would not bend. The cowboy didn't turn to watch them scatter. He kept his back to the girl, shoulders squared, until the last of the sneers faded into mutters and the street grew empty again. Only then did he glance down at her, his voice quieter, but no less steady. "Ain't no one laying another hand on you while I stand?" She swallowed hard, her lips trembling as though words wanted to escape but couldn't. Instead, she clung tighter to his coat, her small frame trembling not from fear anymore, but from the fragile spark of safety she had never known. The street had grown unnaturally quiet, where jeers once filled the air. Now only the shuffle of boots and the restless snort of horses broke the silence. The cowboy stood steady, his shadow long across the dust until the last mutters died away. Then slowly he turned, not to the crowd, but to the girl. Her frame looked smaller now in the emptiness of the square. She hugged her arms close, her lips cracked and trembling. Her hunger showed in every hollow curve of her cheeks, in the way her eyes flickered toward the crumbs scattered in the dirt near the saloon doors. The cowboy reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a rough-wrapped bundle. He crouched low, his spurs whispering against the dust, and unwrapped it to reveal a chunk of bread, plain, hard from the trail, but food nonetheless. He broke it in half and held a piece out to her. At first she only stared. Hunger burned in her eyes, but so did fear. Every outstretched hand in her life had meant pain, mockery, or rejection. She trembled, glancing between the bread and his weathered face. "Go on," he said, his voice softer than the crowd had ever heard it. "It's yours." Her small, shaking hand lifted, hesitant as a bird taking flight. Fingers brushed the bread. She snatched it, as if afraid someone might take it from her, and pressed it close. Then slowly she took a bite. The taste was rough, but her lips parted in the faintest gasp. Her eyes filled, not just from the food, but from the unfamiliar weight of kindness. She ate carefully, almost reverently, crumbs catching in her tangled hair. For the first time, the cruel hunger in her belly eased, if only slightly. The cowboy stayed crouched, watching her. Then he stood, towering once more, and glanced toward his horse tethered nearby. Without hesitation, he stepped over, loosened the reins, and led the animal forward. Dust curled around its hooves as it stopped before the girl. He knelt again, lowering himself to one knee so that his eyes were level with hers. The murmurs of the crowd swirled faintly behind them, but his words were meant only for her. "You've walked enough, little one," he said. "Time you rode." Her lips parted, confusion and disbelief mingling in her stare. She looked past him at the townsfolk, their faces red with shame, their eyes downcast. Not one dared laugh now. Then she looked back at him. His gaze held steady, offering no mockery, only promise. With a trembling breath, she whispered her first words, fragile, cracked, yet carrying all the trust she could muster. "Will you keep me safe?" His jaw tightened, his eyes softening just slightly beneath the brim of his hat. "Ain't a soul alive gonna harm you while I draw breath." For a moment, silence stretched. Then, with a gentleness few would have believed of him, he placed his hands at her waist. She stiffened at the touch, but when he lifted her, it was with care as if she weighed no more than a feather. He set her on the saddle, her bare feet dangling above the stirrups, her small body dwarfed by the leather seat. She clutched the horn nervously, glancing down, but his steady hand on her back reassured her. In one fluid motion, he swung up behind her. His presence filled the space around her. Not a cage, but a fortress. One arm rested lightly around her, protective but unbinding. She leaned back, trembling still, but now against the steady strength of his chest. The crowd stood silent. Shame hung thick in the air. No one spat, no one sneered. The horse, proud and unshaken, seemed transformed. Its saddle no longer just leather and steel, but a chariot lifting the child from scorn into dignity. The cowboy gathered the reins. Dust rose as the horse stepped forward, carrying them both away from the square. Behind them, silence lingered like a wound. Before them stretched the open road, and for the girl, a future no longer bound to hunger or shame, but to the promise of safety at last. The ride from town stretched long beneath the fading sun, yet the girl did not ask where they were going. She clung to the saddle horn, silent, her small body pressed against the cowboy's steady frame. Each hoofbeat carried her farther from the jeers, from the stones, from the hunger that had defined her life. By the time the horse crested a low rise, the ranch came into view. It wasn't grand, a weathered house of rough timber, a barn leaning slightly from years of storms, fences stretching across the land. But to her eyes it seemed like a fortress. Smoke curled gently from the chimney, carrying the scent of wood fire on the cool air. The cowboy slowed the horse to a walk, then dismounted in one fluid motion. He reached up and lifted her down, as though she were something fragile. Her bare feet touched the packed earth of the yard, but this ground felt different. Safe. Inside, warmth greeted her. A fire snapped in the hearth, its glow painting the rough-hewn walls in amber. The cowboy fetched a pot from the hearthstone, ladled stew into a wooden bowl, and set it before her at the table. The smell made her dizzy. Meat, carrots, potatoes rich with broth. "Eat," he said simply. She obeyed. At first with caution, then with desperate hunger she could no longer hide. Spoonful after spoonful disappeared, her small hands trembling as if afraid the food would vanish before she finished. When at last the bowl was empty, her chest rose and fell with a quiet sigh, contentment strange and unfamiliar. The cowboy brought a blanket, coarse but warm, and wrapped it around her shoulders. Her eyes blinked in the firelight, heavy with exhaustion, yet her lips trembled with unasked questions. Finally, in a voice barely more than a whisper, she spoke. "Why? Why me?" The cowboy paused, resting one hand on the back of the chair. His gaze held steady, calm as a river stone. "Because no child should starve," he said, "while men have bread." Her breath caught, and tears, long denied, welled in her eyes. She lowered her face, letting them fall into the folds of the blanket. Not from shame, but from the strange ache of being seen. When he led her to the small room down the hall, the bed waiting there looked like a miracle. Clean sheets, a pillow soft from years of use, a quilt folded neatly at the foot. She touched it with disbelief, then lay down slowly, her thin frame sinking into the mattress. The cowboy stood in the doorway a long moment, his shadow cast by the firelight. For the first time in her life, she drifted toward sleep, not on cold earth, not in alley shadows, but beneath a roof strong enough to keep out the wind. And as the fire crackled, the story closed not in hunger or cruelty, but in promise. They threw stones at the hungry girl, but the cowboy gave her bread, a place to belong, and a name that would never be forgotten.